Awesome.
Welcome in, everyone, on a Wednesday afternoon here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you stopping by for an impromptu session with Steve Merrill from Wager Talk. So Steve and I get together each and every Thursday, typically, record all the segments, looking over the biggest games in college football, getting all the information, all the insight, the math model, and all the numbers and the metrics and the winning edge, you could say, from Steve each and every week. And we deliver those on the various channels here at the Voice of College Football. Today, we thought we would do something a little bit different. You can leave your comments and questions there in the live chat. We'll be live for the next hour or so, something in that range, to talk college football and the biggest games coming up this week. Steve Merrill, Wager Talk is the place to be for Steve's complete look at not just college football. It's also Major League Baseball. Of course, the championship series going on right now. We've got the NFL. We've got the NBA also starting here very soon. And you can catch Steve not just for the selections on the games themselves, but a complete money management system to know how to approach all of this in the best possible way. Again, it's wagertalk.com. And also you can catch Steve's work at Wager Talk TV right here on YouTube. Steve, I always look forward to these sessions, and we'll get some comments and questions, hopefully, from the chat as well. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, Mark, this worked out great. Yeah, NBA started last night on Tuesday, 2 games, a full lineup tonight on Wednesday. The World Series starts Friday, so I was like, let's get it in on Wednesday. Let's not chance being overloaded on Thursday. This is the busiest time of the year. Every major sport is going. Every professional sport is going for the next week until baseball finishes. It's a pretty cool time.
When we do the sessions on Thursday, I remind myself constantly, this is not just college football for Steve, because I would be amazed if it was just college football. But
True.
considering the interest in the NFL, obviously, is the king of sports in this country, and the NBA and the Major League Baseball schedule, I don't know how you do it.
Well, I'll tell you what, I try to automate as much as possible. And as we go through these college football games, I mentioned my database simulation. And I will say it takes less work for me this time of year in college football than it did maybe in September, right? But the NBA is going to probably take more work this time of year than it will in January or February. So I think now that we're in the second half of the college football season, we have some good statistical numbers to work with. What I'd like to try to find, though, is maybe situations in which those numbers don't tell the whole story, right? And we saw Virginia pull that huge upset last week against North Carolina as over a 3-touchdown dog. Was that perhaps the buy sign for a team like Virginia with a new head coach who's been struggling this year but's played a pretty tough schedule? So that's kind of how I approach this second half of the college football season. Is I use my numbers, but I also like to try to find some, under the value, under the radar, as we like to say, type of teams as well.
I don't know if anybody out there has done any kind of studies in regards to the way the public works against the betting lines, because I would figure, even though a person like myself, or maybe some fans as well, will take it to that degree, that certainly have more tangible and more credible information and metrics as the season goes along. Vegas obviously has much more advanced metrics to go on that make it, I would think, more difficult for the average person to get a winning edge later in the season, even though there are more information to us. But for a guy like you, do you find yourself possibly having an easier time or a tougher time, or maybe just a different uh, approach to it later in the season when you have more analytics to go on?
Yeah, it's a totally different type of handicap. And I talk about this with the NFL as well. I break the NFL into quarters every 4 games. They play 17 now, but it's still basically 4-4, quarters of the season. College football, it's basically every 3 games, right? Because everyone plays 12 now. So a quarter of the season's 3, 6. We're into that third quarter now, the 7 to 9 game range. And the first 3, 4 games of the season, whether it's college or pro football, I think you look to ride on underrated teams or maybe fade teams that are just worse than people realize. And you'll see teams start 0-3, 0-4 against the spread. Second quadrant, you start to try to find reasons to play some of those teams that got off to a bad start, but maybe are decent. A lot of times we see that with like MAC teams that play those monster schedules out of conference in September, but are a lot better than their overall numbers indicate. Now that we're in the third quadrant and into the fourth quadrant, I do rely on my math a lot in the numbers, but like you said, Vegas, the lines are very sharp now. The lines are definitely softer in September, and you're going to find more variance. But the edge you have as a sports bettor, and you and I have talked about this a lot over the years, is that they have to put numbers up on every game, right? They have to put lines up on all 50 college football games, 40 or 50 games every week. I only have to find 3, 4, 5 games in which I think the lines are off by a few points to have a mathematical edge. And that's what I do. I have 3 or 4 best bets every Saturday at wagertalk.com. They're my strongest plays, the strongest of the strongest. And they've done quite well over the years. And I find this time of the year, you can find games like that. Because keep in mind, the point spread is mystical. Everyone's always amazed how accurate it is. In most games, there is no value. It's a 50-50 coin flip with the point spread. But all a point spread is basically just margin of victory with factoring in the schedule strength. And the odds makers don't vary that a lot during the course of the season. So if a team really has turned the corner like maybe Virginia has after last week, they're still basing that point spread on all the games. That's the real quandary you become into as a handicapper and odds makers. How much do you adjust for current form basis the overall seasonal form? And I think this time of the year, that's the trick, which can point to a lot of winners for you.
I was actually just going to bring that up in regards to the overall stats. People look at yards per play, yards per game,
Right.
and then thinking, okay, if we're in week 10, let's say, and we're in week 9, in reality right now, how much are those numbers weighed into it from weeks and weeks and weeks ago, as opposed to the more recent team, because teams change from week to week and change throughout the season in regards to who's in decline and who's ascending. Certainly, there's something that we hit on occasionally, Steve, in terms of the point spreads, and for the casual bettor out there who looks at the lines, they may think, okay, it was a 3-point spread a couple days ago. Now it's 3.5. Big deal. It's a half a point. But talk to the difference on that particular number, but just overall in regards to what percentage of games may hinge on just that half point.
Yeah, well, let's take basketball. I mentioned the NBA started last night, right? And there's really no key numbers in basketball because everything's 1, 2s, and 3s. You're talking about a couple hundred points being scored. So the difference between 3 or 3.5 or 4 in the NBA is, the same as it's 5 or 5.5. There's just no key numbers. There is some argument, by the way, for anybody who's high level out there might chat right now and say, hey, Steve, there is a semi-key number. There's some talk that 7 is a key number in basketball because teams stop fouling once they're down by more than 7. So sometimes that's the key number, but not by much. But my point is every half a point in basketball is like a 3 to 4% advantage for you long term. So if you can get +4 instead of +3, you're going to win, 3, 4, 5% more of your plays just on math. And football is different. There's the way scoring happens in football. It's mostly 3s and 7s that are scored. And lo and behold, those are the key margins as well. Teams win by 3 more than any other margin. They win by 7. Second most, 10, obviously. College football, we see 14 and 17 come into play. And yes, the difference between +3 and +3.5 is almost 8, 9% long term in college football. There's an 8 to 9% chance when you have a 3-point favorite or dog, that game's going to land exactly on 3. So that half point is critical. If you could just get a free half point on every play you make, you wouldn't even have to handicap. You'd have a mathematical edge. That's how important it is to line shop. And it's funny, Mark, people shop around for the best price on a TV set. I did a money management article 27 years ago when I started in the mid 90s. And in the article I put how it amazes me people will shop around to save $200 or $300 on a television or a VCR. Had to update that article a little bit in recent years, but the premise is still the same. Everyone only has one sportsbook account. Now it's legal in over half the states in the U.S. You can get 10 or 15 accounts. Find those extra half points. They're free, and they'll make you a lot of money during the season.
And then there's also an aspect of this that you brought up or alluded to just a few minutes ago in regards to in college football with 133 teams and just about everyone playing. You've got 50 to 60 games being played. There's obviously an attraction toward big games.
Right.
People just automatically, oh, it's a big game, I'm going to play those games. Well, the money's the same. The money doesn't know how big the game is. And the value is not necessarily in the big games. In fact, the value is probably not in the bigger games.
Correct. In fact, if you want to know the best sports to beat, the ones where you can get the biggest mathematical edge, all you have to do is look at what the sportsbook limits are for those sports. And here's textbook example. The NFL, they'll let you bet $50,000 like it's nothing on the side. College football, they'll let you bet 10, 20,000, probably more nowadays because everything's so well known. College basketball, NBA, 20, 30,000 tonight. College basketball starts in a few weeks. Most limits are like $5,000 on a college basketball game. On a college basketball over-under, it's like 1,000. Because you're talking about hundreds, even twice as many, up to 300 college basketball teams have point spreads. So on a Saturday, there can be over 100 games on the board that they have to put odds up on. And yes, Vegas is looking at numbers. They're looking at math. They don't have all the information about a guy in the Big Sky Conference or the Big West Conference if someone's hurt, or if a team's underperforming or a new player's in the lineup. So, yeah, if you really want to know the sports you can beat, you just look at the limits. With that said, though, I have found myself over the last 10, 15 years using more big-time teams in college football. When the MAC first became on the betting rotation about 20 years ago in the late 90s, I did extremely well betting the small college games. But I use a horse racing analogy. Like, yeah, the public is all over the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, the big tracks, but I also like the class of those horses. And I just enjoy handicapping the bigger teams now because I feel like I get a more clean, true handicap. There's just more random variance with lower level teams, in the MAC, the Sun Belt, talent-wise. So it's funny, when I first started 20, 25 years ago, I liked those under-the-radar teams, and we still do it. Hey, look, the under-the-radar segment's done incredibly well the last couple of years on Patreon here for your channel. But yeah, I do like the top 25 games. And you mentioned the public earlier. One way you can definitely use public sentiment is when they're on underdogs. And you'll notice in these top 25 matchups, the public all of a sudden stops playing favorites and they start playing dogs. Last week, they were on Tennessee against Alabama. They were on Penn State against Ohio State. They were on Duke against Florida State. It's amazing how wrong they get it more times than not when they're on an underdog, and that's usually a high-profile dog.
What I also find, Steve, is people are excited about the games themselves. So they get excited about the action. And just because there are some close calls, we saw Oklahoma taken to the limit against UCF. We saw Texas come within a touchdown versus Houston, and the Cougars had a shot to win that game. We saw Washington get pushed against Arizona State. So because of the excitement of the games, I'll jump on here every Saturday night late after all the primetime games are over and take calls. And people are just like, oh, that was the craziest week. It was just so crazy today. And this is unlike any other college football season, the results, and there's so many upsets and da-da-da-da. And I'm like, can you bring me some metrics that are, in fact, supporting that there are more upsets, that you're getting caught up in the close calls and all of that. I keep track of, and Steve, I am nowhere in your league when it comes to this. I just watch a lot of college football, and we talk college football here every day. So obviously I'm watching about as much as anyone, but in regards to the numbers, I'm just a novice at this and just have fun with it. And, but I have tracked it. It did come to me 4 or 5 years ago. Let's track how many upsets are in the top 25, just straight out upsets. I'm just curious. And that has been like clockwork, where they're on the typical college football weekend are about 19 to 22 top 25 games because of buys and because of top 25 teams playing one another. And it's like clockwork that there are about 4 to 5 upsets.
Well, the other thing, I was going to say, there's a lot of parity among the bottom 10 or 15 in the rankings as well, as you know.
Exactly. And that's part of it is I think that the elites just continue to be the elites. Right. And then there's a rapid drop off where you can throw out 40 teams in the country and who knows who's going to win those games. But people, the public seems to think, oh, this current college football season, for example, has just been a crazy season. But I'm not seeing it when I look at the amount of upsets per week. It seems to be pretty standard. Has this season in any way been abnormal?
I don't track it per se. The eye test, I would say no, because I think I think you're bringing up a good point that people remember the big upsets more than they remember the teams that don't get upset. And an analogy I'll use with that is everyone talks about bad beats. You remember all the bad beats you've had, which is a tough loss, which you should have won, and something weird happens. It's mathematically a certainty that there's basically 50-50 on every single bad beat. There's a good beat on the other side of that. And yet, when do you ever hear people talk about that, Mark, right? No one ever. And I've been doing this for 27, 28 years now. I don't think anyone's ever had a good beat story. And it's like, and I can't remember many good beats, to be honest. I can name 5 or 10 terrible bad beats. In fact, ESPN always does that segment with the bad beats, and they always had that play with Ohio State runs back the fumble against Northwestern. I remember that vividly because we had Northwestern. Final play of the game, they weren't going to win, but they were covering as an underdog. Final play of the game with the ball, and still didn't cover. So that still goes down as one of the worst because I was involved, and I always remember that. But I'm sure I've been on other sides of games like that, and I can't recall them because when you chalk them up, you're like, hey, I got the win there. But when it's a loss, that's a bad beat. It's a bad beat. So it's the same thing with these upsets. They just stand out more. And to my point, I do a top 25 video every week for Wager Talk TV, wagertalk.com. And the premise is the head-to-head top 25 matchups. And I usually get about 3 or 4. Early in the season, I have to dig deeper. We actually had a week, I think week 3 this year, we had no matchups because of all the non-conference play. But what I've started doing this season is using a little baseball analogy, games that were just a bit outside, games in additional votes in the top 30. And it's amazing how many of those teams, end up in the top 25. Next week, one of the teams I talk about gets bumped down. And one angle that's worked extremely well, and my colleague Brian Power over at wagertalk.com and I have talked about this since last college basketball season, is when you have an unranked favorite, and it's almost always a home favorite, obviously, but an unranked home favorite against a ranked underdog. Those teams have been money in the bank. They've hit over 70% ATS. It was great in college hoops, and it's been really good in the college football as well. We had UCLA a few weeks ago, and we also had Kentucky when they beat Florida the week before that. It's an angle to keep an eye on, but also an angle to keep an eye on is when teams first get ranked. And it'd be interesting to see what James Madison does because they snuck into the rankings now at 25 after being 26 last week. Sometimes there's a little bit of a letdown, a Sports Illustrated type cover thing to that as well. So lots of ways to use the rankings. I think for the most part they're bogus, but as a handicapper, I do use them for the reasons I mentioned.
Yeah, and I got to think one of those reasons is that, as you just alluded to a few minutes ago, that the bottom portion of the rankings are kind of arbitrary, meaning that just because you're number 26 and you don't get a number next to your name, you like a few weeks ago, the number 26 team in the nation was only 8 points receiving votes under number 25, and the gap between 24 and 25 was 40 points in poll votes. It's just an arbitrary list that they just stop at 25, and the process isn't any different for the other teams receiving votes. And I got to think that in those cases of UCLA and Kentucky, they were extremely close to being ranked, and so they're generally just as good as the bottom 5 or 8 teams in the rankings.
Exactly.
And that's where you get that value.
Well, and one thing I'll point out about the rankings too, the reason I've never paid much attention to them is that it's all based on straight up win, right? So North Carolina falls 7 spots. They were 10th last week. They're now 17th. Had they found a way to win that game by like a single point, they probably don't move. But they were like a 23-point favorite. So to me, that's a vast underachievement. That's a loss no matter how you cut it. Just like Miami of Florida, that debacle against Tech a few weeks ago where they give up that awful loss, don't take a knee. They were still a 19-point favorite. Even though they take the knee there, that was not an impressive showing by them. Yet it seems like the polls don't take that into account. I think the North Carolina example would have been very interesting. Would they have stayed 10th? Because Penn State has now fallen to 10th, 3 spots. They lose at Ohio State, and they didn't look good. I had a best bet on Ohio State, by the way, and we talked about it here on the channel last week. But still, they shouldn't get penalized too much for losing to one of the best teams on the road in a fairly low-scoring game. So that's another reason the rankings are kind of silly. But as with anything, when it's inaccurate, there's ways to step in and take advantage, because I do think it still plays a role with how the odds are set, because the public knows these teams. And when they see a higher ranked team as an underdog, that usually is a public dog as well. And as I mentioned earlier, those are great teams to fade normally.
And maybe the best example of what you're just talking about right now is the Washington-Oregon game.
Right.
Oregon goes in there, I believe, seventh or eighth ranked in the country, and Washington's fifth. Oregon's playing a road game that goes down to the very final play of the game, which is a missed field goal. They outgain Washington by about 140 yards. It's just a complete toss-up of the game. The rankings, isn't the number 6 or 7 team in the country supposed to lose at the number 5 team in the country on the final play of the game? Isn't that pretty much what we would expect? And the traditional polls drop Oregon. I actually raised Oregon 2 spots. Yeah. It justified their value, the quality of their team.
Yeah. I actually just went back and checked my notes from October 12th. Oregon was number 8. Washington was number 7 heading into that game in the AP poll. And they were a 3-point underdog. It's basically where it lands. Like you said, they hit the field goal. It's a push in regulation, which means that's a win in my book. Because like you said, they should have lost by 3. They basically tied them on the road. They outgained them, which I think that point is huge. 140-some yards. That's basically winning the game more times than not. So you're exactly right. And here again, power ratings, I did bump them, and I didn't necessarily penalize Washington. I think they're 2 of the best teams in the country. But yeah, nothing wrong with Oregon. Yet from a handicapping perspective, you got to be careful, because it could be a bubble burster, right? So then that's where the whole situational handicapping aspect comes in, because I actually raised Oregon power rating wise, but that following week, you got to tack on several less points just because you don't know how their mindset's going to be when they're coming as like maybe a double-digit road favorite in the next game. So that's the art of handicapping, but you're exactly right. That's another example of where the polls make no sense, because Oregon did everything they should and actually outperformed in my metrics.
All right, Steve, why don't we jump into some of these games? We'll start with Clemson and NC State. And I want to remind everyone that you can catch Steve at Wager Talk TV right here on YouTube, and also wagertalk.com. And again, he covers not just college football, the NFL, NBA starting, and Major League Baseball, the World Series almost underway. Clemson, of course, having a horrific year by their standards. They're 4-3 straight up. They went to Miami last weekend as a 3.5 point favorite, had a 10-point lead in the fourth quarter, lost in overtime by 8. NC State has gone to a backup quarterback situation after Brennan Armstrong has faltered. So they've got MJ Morris now starting the games, and they scored all of 3 points against Duke 2 weeks ago. So we've got a game. Clemson is a 10-point favorite at NC State. The over-under is 44.
Yeah, once again, my simulation has all the games taken into account, so you have to be a little careful. Like you said, NC State's had those quarterback issues. Using everything this season, I've got Clemson winning by 7.5 on average. So the line is a little inflated, especially at 10 or more, which is pretty much across the board now. It did open 9.5. Briefly, were some 9.5s, 10.5s. It's been jumping around this week. You do worry big time about Clemson's mindset. We said that after 2 losses, right? And they go up to Syracuse a few weeks ago and an impressive 31-14 win, which looked like a really tough scheduling spot. The flat spot apparently came against Wake, I guess, the following week when they barely won. I did like Miami as a live dog, getting 3 or more last week at home. Obviously, that game could have gone either way. If they don't have a 3-1 turnover deficit, I doubt they lose that game. But they did lose that game, and it's also their 3rd loss of the season. ACC, national title, everything's basically done at this point. These are the situations you worry about. Now, with that said, Clemson is a very good defensive team, but I always feel like letdowns happen more on the defensive side of the ball, and they're not a good offensive team. Neither is NC State. So I lean NC State based on the value. If Clemson's D does show up, the under probably would be the way to look also, with 2 struggling offenses, but 44 is a pretty low total, especially if it's a flat spot for that Clemson D.
Question for you, Steve, before we move on to the next game, which we'll look at Tennessee and Kentucky. There's the term trap game. There's the term letdown game. And I don't in any way disagree with anyone when they bring those terms up to say that those don't exist. I have just never seen a metric given to it, first of all, to define what a trap game is, because we can all spot them, but you have to give it some kind of parameter to say, right, well, this is what we're going to keep track of. We're going to keep track of a ranked team that just played a ranked team, now playing an unranked team, or whatever the metric or the parameters you want to put on it. So it first has to be defined, because I think we can all spot them as football fans, but there still has to be a definition of it. And then secondly, has anyone gone through to track to whether the psychology or what we believe are trap games and letdown games actually come to fruition?
Yeah, there's actually Ralph Michaels at wagertalk.com. We call him Stat Daddy, the human database, and chart master. He does a lot of database work and systems work, and he's actually quantified a couple of things you're talking about. First of all, back when I started in the 90s, there was an angle years ago. A team lost its first game after game 8 or later, was only about a 40% play against the spread. That was a letdown because it was called a bubble burst. That's back when one loss would eliminate you most of the time, right? So that's not the case now with the playoff format, the championship format. So Ralph's dug a little bit deeper, and the second loss now, game 7 or later, those teams are only about a 40% play ATS. So that's kind of quantified right there what we're talking about when your national title hopes are shot. But another angle that's been around since overtime started over 20 plus years ago, and it continues to work, is teams off an overtime game, especially road teams and road dogs. There's different metrics, but teams off college overtime games have underperformed. If you blindly bet against them, you have made money for decades. And that's also a fatigue letdown situation. So, yes, it's technically Clemson's third loss, but I think you could definitely say they're probably going to be a little flat. And then they're off the overtime as well. So there is some quantified evidence over the years that these are flat spots. And those are kind of the letdowns I look for.
We go to the SEC for a couple teams that have played themselves out of championship contention, with Georgia still undefeated. Tennessee has yet to play Georgia, but they've lost 2 games. That second being a tough one in Tuscaloosa against Bama, where they led by 2 scores at halftime and got completely annihilated, 27-0 in the second half. Kentucky has proven to be a more marginal team than there was some early season hope. After 4 consecutive wins, they defeated Florida at a big matchup against Georgia, were blown out by 38. So we've got Tennessee as a 3.5-point favorite at Kentucky, over under at 51.5.
Yeah, I actually did a standalone video earlier this week on Monday. It's still up at Wager Talk TV on YouTube. In-depth deep dive into this game. I'd recommend checking that out. And my 10,000 game simulation database takes a couple days, usually ready Tuesday or Wednesday. So I didn't have the numbers at the time. As you mentioned, Tennessee a 3.5-point favorite. But now that I've had the database numbers, I got them winning on average by 5.5. So there is some line value with Tennessee here. But the situational setup for Tennessee concerns me for several reasons. First of all, you mentioned the second loss. As I just said, that could be a bubble burster. And then on top of that, it's coming against Alabama, is always a physical team. And Kentucky has the benefit of a bye week. Kentucky, public dog, once again, we talked about fading public dogs. Kentucky was a very public dog weeks ago against Georgia. Georgia had not covered the spread all season. One of the rare times in betting where you can get probably the best team in the country at a discounted price. It's like buying one of the best stocks at a discounted price. And that's what Georgia was a few weeks ago. I had a strong best bet on them. Talked about them here on this channel with you. I had them in my college football top 25 video. So yes, my paid clients got that, but you also got it free here. You got it free on Wager Talk TV as well. And I think that was a little bit of a bubble burst for Kentucky. And whenever you play a physical team like Georgia, Alabama, it's hard to come back the next week. They lose by 17 as a home favorite against Missouri. But I think the bye came at a really good time. So I think the setup actually favors Kentucky here, but Tennessee is the better team. There is some line value. So I'm going to stay off the side. I'm going to look at the total here. You mentioned 51.5. We talk about key numbers. 51 is one of the most key total numbers. A lot of margins get us there. 31-20, 27-24. A lot of different final scores get you on 51. There's about a 3 to 4% chance this game lands 51 exact. So at 51.5 or more, I like the under. And this Tennessee offense is really down this year. They were explosive last year, slightly above average this year, but their defense is surprisingly really good, giving up only about 4.5 yards per play. Kentucky is very one-dimensional. They run the ball. Tennessee's only giving up about 3 yards per carry. So I do like the under here. My only concern, once again, would be the hangover, the letdown for Tennessee, how fatigued the defense is. But I'm just not sure Kentucky can take advantage of that. I think under 51.5 makes a lot of sense.
Our guy Mike in the chat says that used to be any game with a spread that is between 1.5 to even, the home team won or covered that game like 65% of the time. That's a huge percentage. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've never seen that per se. I wouldn't read too much into that. One thing I will say about any kind of back testing is obviously you want a large sample size, right? And you want it to, be over several years. There's obviously probably some times in which that has happened, but I would think it's probably a narrow time frame. But also, it has to make sense, and that actually kind of makes some sense because once again, we talked about key numbers of three. So if it's under three, it's a basic straight up win situation because 1 and 2 aren't as key. But the other thing that's tricky as well is like the lines vary, and I can find an extra half point on every single game, as I mentioned earlier. Yet another reason why you should have multiple sports books and shop for value. So when you're doing the back testing too, it's hard to say, was the line really 1 or was it really 1.5? So I don't like to do too much systems and back testing, which is really line sensitive like that, because I think you kind of just get some random variance.
All right, Steve. Well, next up, we got Georgia and Florida. And again, everyone, join Steve on wagertalk.com and Wagertalk TV. You get the full array of not just college football, but the complete landscape of every major sport with Steve right there. And you get your under the radar selection. That's on Patreon with us, patreon.com/MarkRogersTV, or as a YouTube channel member. So you're on the main channel right now, folks. If you sign up right here, just get yourself a $3 membership here on the YouTube channel. You get Steve's under the radar selection that's hitting at 17-4. Steve, we've got Florida and Georgia. They always get together at a neutral site in Jacksonville. Of course, Georgia is a much better program at this point, but Florida has played some decent football, came back from multiple scores down to South Carolina in their last outing. They've got a bye week coming into this. Georgia's a 14.5-point favorite. The over-under is at 48.5.
Yeah, my database simulation has Georgia winning on average by 14.4. That's just to say this line is spot on would be an understatement. And another example of a lot of times, it's a huge game, big game to talk about, but the line is pretty much where it should be. We have seen some money coming on the under. It opened 48.5. It's down to 47 now in most locations. 14 is a very key number. This open 14.5. It has not moved across the board. Every major sports book is 14.5. I would say this: if you like Florida, I would play it now. The risk reward on losing 14.5 to 14 or 15 is not worth it. So lock up 14.5 if you like Florida. If you like Georgia, I'd wait. Minus 14 is obviously a pretty key number. So this is another example, another handicapping example of when you play the games matter as well. Earlier in the week, obviously, you want to play a game if you think that line's going to move on and off a key number. By the way, Mark, the look-ahead line a few months ago in this game, when they were out this summer, was 21.5. And Florida at 5-2 hasn't really outperformed, I don't think, for the most part. So it's pretty interesting that it's a touchdown lower than what it was projected to be this summer. And once again, I think the reason is because Georgia has only covered one game all season, and that was that Kentucky game I mentioned from a few weeks ago. They came right back, won by 17, but did not cover as a 33-point road favorite at Vanderbilt. They have the bye week, though. Once again, this is exactly where my math is, and I just don't want to get in front of Georgia in a focused spot. That's why I loved them against Kentucky, and we had line value in that game. We're not getting the line value here, but we're also not getting a bad line. And if you look at the advanced summer line, we're actually getting a touchdown of value. If this gets down to 14 or less, I would definitely side in with Georgia at that point.
Jackson is asking about Utah and Oregon. We will get to it. We'll just stay in order here. We'll stay in the South here, go to the ACC. Florida State, of course, had a tussle against Duke, so that was an extremely close game. For most of the game, Duke was actually up 3, driving inside the 10. Riley Leonard at quarterback gets knocked out of the game. They bring in the backup, Henry Beelan. They bypass the field goal on a 4th and 3 that would have taken them up by 6. And this is still fairly early in the game, mid-third quarter. They don't convert on the 4th down. They're up 20-17. They get blown away from there without their starting quarterback and having that momentum surge Florida State's way. So Florida State does cover that 2-touchdown spread against Duke. They went by 18. They're a 20.5-point favorite at Wake Forest. This has been a difficult spot for Florida State against Wake in recent years, but it's a much better Florida State team, and it's a much worse Wake team than in recent years. The over-under is 51, Steve.
Yeah, most of the time we do these games, I get a couple points of variance. So the new viewers out there are going to think I disagree with the point spreads. But this one, 20.3 is my projection. It's at 20.5. So first time ever, I think we've had back-to-back games, double-digit favorites that have been exactly right. Yeah, I mean, what do you do with Florida State? They've been very suspect at defense this year. And we talked about bad beats. I mean, I think you got to chalk Duke up as one of the baddest beats of the season. And, yes, the way it finished, you look at it, you're like, well, they gave up 21 in the fourth. But yeah, I mean, they were outplaying Florida State, winning the game, outgaining them, everything with a star quarterback. And when he went out, they were awful. So you really can make a case if Florida State probably wouldn't even have won last week. They come in now 6-1 instead of 7-0. But they did escape, And the problem with Florida State is they've been very suspect on defense at times. I just don't know if Wake Forest can take advantage of that. They're below average, both running and throwing the ball. They don't have what we call backdoor cover potential. By the way, Wake Forest has gone under now in 5 straight games. They went over against Elon and Vanderbilt. By the way, Vanderbilt, the only team in the nation, I believe, that's gone over every game this season. So after they went over against Vandy, they've gone under every game since. I just don't trust the Florida State D to play any defense at times. So, yeah, I don't see a lot of value in this one. 20.5 is pretty much where it should be. Normally, you'd say maybe this is a little bit of a flat spot. They've got Pitt on deck. I just don't know if Wake can keep it close. Florida State really explosive offensively, and I just don't know if Wake can keep up. If I had to play it, I'd lay it, especially at 20.5, because once again, 21 is a pretty key number.
Steve, we are deprived this week of one of our favorite breakdowns. It's a bye week for the Iowa Hawkeyes, but we'll bring that up anyway because classic Iowa fashion last week. The Hawkeyes and Minnesota. Now you put those two together and then you really got something because Minnesota is not quite in Iowa's class, but they typically bring in the low totals as well. Those two get together. There was a controversial play at the end of the game that did not affect the betting line because they didn't even come close to the over under of what I believe it dropped. I saw it at 30.5.
Yeah.
and they put up 22 points between the two of them.
Yeah, Mark, we talked about how 37 is like the most key number. I mean, this is something I didn't talk about until like 20 years ago. The NFL lines used to always hover around 37 and 41. Those are the two key. I mentioned 51 earlier. And once again, Ralph Michaels at wagertalk.com showed this a couple weeks ago. If you've just blindly played the under like the last 7 years when the total's 36.5 or less, which means you're getting an awful line theoretically because 37 is a really key number. It'd have been 20-5 to the under. And then that week, Michigan State, Iowa go over because of a defensive score, land on 42. They've stayed under that every one of their last 3 games. Yeah, last week dropped when you and I were talking on Thursday, 31.5. There were some 31 starting to show, and 31 is another key number, which we never bring up except for maybe the NFL preseason. Do we ever see 31s? But obviously 31 is a very key number, 17-14, 21-10, right? A lot of games get you there, a lot of scores. And yes, you're right. That did close as low as 30.5 on Saturday, and it still did not matter. And I was the one team, by the way, that did drop out of that top 25 poll. I think they were 24th last week. They're barely in the top 40 now. What a waste of a good defense. For several years now, we keep saying that. And Francis Sun is not going to get that bonus for, 24 points a game they got to average. That is, I mean, if there's ever a reason to root against a college football team, and I know the Iowa channel is not going to like this, but that was such a ridiculous clause that you almost have to be happy to see it not happening.
Yes, that clause, Steve, at 25 points per game would have ranked the Iowa offense at 91st in the nation. So they're giving bonuses for finishing 91st in scoring offense, and they still can't even hit that. They are a composite 44 points below that. They have to make up 44 points in the final 4 games of the season to make that up.
They might not score that. You're talking about on average, right?
They have to. They're down by 44 total points.
Oh, total. Oh, well, that's 11. That's like what 11 a game, probably. But
yeah, that's 11 per game.
Yeah, I'm surprised they're that. I'll be honest. I'm surprised they're that close to get to it.
Yeah,
to be honest, I mean that's just how bad that. But it's just such a waste of a great D. It's amazing they can't get some kind of offense, but it's been like that for several years now.
D and special teams. Their punter has been the special teams player of the week 3 consecutive weeks.
Well, he gets a lot of opportunities to practice.
Yeah, he does. He does at that. Another strange bird here. This Miami football program has been a Jekyll and Hyde outfit for quite a long time. Mario Cristobal has his good moments and his bad. He's recruiting like a man, but the game management in question, of course, and hit its zenith against Georgia Tech a few weeks ago. So Miami coming off a big win, though, after losing 2 consecutive, had to wonder where their heads were, and they came back from 10 down against Clemson at home, had not defeated Clemson since 2010. So they do get that victory. They're taking on a Virginia team that's got to be riding high. They had lost, oh, shoot, I don't have the numbers in front of me, like 9 consecutive Power 5 games, 9 or 10 consecutive conference games. And they pull that game out against North Carolina team. The stat that I saw from last week's game, Steve, was that was the first time since 1961, Oklahoma, Missouri, that a team with a 1-5 record or worse defeated a top 10 team on the road.
Yeah, I mean, some of the people I know in the Carolina area said it's the worst loss ever for the football. And you're like, boy, that seems a little extreme. But then you start realizing what was on the line. They were undefeated, ranked number 10 in the country, theoretically controlled their own destiny for the national title still. And then you're over a 3-touchdown favorite. You just cannot lose a game. They closed as high as a 24-point favorite. So just from a point spread perspective, it was one of the bigger upsets. We've seen more of those in recent years with all the parity now, but still, you don't see a lot of 24-point underdogs win outright. That happens maybe once or twice a whole season. So, yeah, no matter how you cut it, it was a huge upset. I will say this about Virginia. I'm in the Virginia area. I follow these teams closely. It's a shame my alma mater, William & Mary, has started to tank it on their season because they were ranked number 4 in the country this season in FCS. Had a bad loss at Elon in which they outplayed them. And then they had to go to UVA a few weeks ago, hung tight with them for the first 3 quarters or so, then lost, and then had a terrible loss last week for homecoming off their bye. Blew a 17-0 lead against Towson, gave up. It was one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen, Mark. We see this so often. It's 17-3 third quarter. Towson, they hold them on 3rd and 8 in the third quarter. Towson runs a fake punt to continue the drive. They get the first down. Turns into a 22-play, 11.5-minute drive to start the third quarter. 17-10. William & Mary fumbles the next kickoff. 17-7. My point being, they now have 3 losses. They're in big trouble, but that Virginia loss would look so much better. It would have been huge for a team like William & Mary after Virginia goes and beats North Carolina. And as I said at the beginning of the show, I do think maybe we saw the buy sign with Virginia. This is a team I follow very closely. And the point spread can sometimes be a leading indicator when teams are covering but losing. They're keeping it closer than expected. That means they're playing better than expected. And Virginia is now 5-1 straight against the spread their last 6 since their opening loss against Tennessee. And they've now covered 4 straight. So going to that UNC game, there was some momentum. And if you look at their numbers this season, they're not impressive, giving up 5.7 yards per play, 31 points a game, but their opponents have averaged 5.7. They've played some tough offensive opponents, and they throw the ball for 8.2 yards per pass against teams that allow just 7.4. So they actually are a really good passing attack, better than people realize as well. They just don't run the ball very effectively, and they're going to have trouble against Miami's run D. But I do think they'll have some success throwing, and that also gives them backdoor cover potential. My database simulation has Miami winning by about 20 to 20.5 on average. But once again, that's the full season. I think you could probably make a case you could bump that a couple points lower, which gets you right around 19, the current spread. I guess my concern would be, what does Virginia have left in the tank after that huge upset? You do get a little worried about a letdown. But then again, Miami's not in a good spot here at all. So, yeah, I think if you have to play this one, I'd rather have the big dog that's got some momentum that can throw the ball late. And Miami's now coming from a home dog win to laying nearly 3 touchdowns. That's also called a role reversal, something you probably don't want to get in front of.
All right. We got Steve Merrill here. Steve and I get together every Thursday typically and record these segments, and you can find them on all the team channels. But I asked Steve to go live with us today. Just thought it would be a fun thing to do, to talk a little bit more beyond just the matchups, talk about the landscape of wagering, where it stands. And I always learn a ton from Steve. And so I tap him for as much as possible here. UCF, Steve, is coming off a game in which they took Oklahoma right down to the wire. They were just as good, if you didn't know who was who. And they were coming off a series of games in the Big 12 where they were not close. Yeah. They had a 28-point lead in their Big 12 opener against Baylor and blew it, gave up 29 consecutive. And actually, there was a stretch in that game going to the next game against Kansas, Steve, where UCF was outscored 60-0. They gave up the final 29 to Baylor. They gave up the first 31 to Kansas, were blown off the field in that game, just have not competed in the Big 12. Then they show up in Norman and they take Oklahoma right down to the wire and lose on a failed 2-point conversion. West Virginia was a bit of a darling out of the gate. They lost to Penn State, but in the Big 12 got a couple wins, and people were surmising that maybe West Virginia might be a Cinderella this year, but they've come back down to earth. They lost by a couple touchdowns against Oklahoma State. So now UCF's a 7-point favorite at home against West Virginia.
Yeah, and the quarterbacks obviously had some injuries at time, so and we have to keep an eye on that as well. Um, Game simulation actually favors Central Florida by 10 in this one, so there is some line value here. I just don't know about the spot. I think they did lay it on the line, like you said, against Oklahoma, yet they came up short. And I've always said tough losses, I think, linger and cause letdowns more than big wins. So we go back to the Cavaliers, Virginia. I'm not so sure Virginia lets down. I think that could be a momentum builder for them. But you do worry about Central Florida. They've now had 4 straight losses. They've gone 1-3 against the spread in those games. And let's put it in perspective. The only teams they've beaten this year were Kent State, a down Boise State team, and Villanova. They've gone 0-4 in the Big 12 since then. So I do think even though there's a little bit of line value based on my ratings, I'd be a little cautious with them this week. They are an explosive offensive team, though, and they're much, much better than West Virginia. I think West Virginia probably has to keep this game low scoring and keep it under 59 if they want to keep it within the spread.
All right, Steve. Next up, we've got a game in the Big Ten between a couple just mid-level teams, but because it's the Big Ten Western Division, Nebraska, if Wisconsin loses this week, even if they don't, let me correct myself. Yeah, Nebraska is only trailing by 1 game in the standings, and they play Wisconsin later. They play Iowa. They still control their own destiny, but besides just a 2-2 record in the conference, 4-3 overall. And they played an ugly game against Northwestern last week, defensive battle. Couple turnovers early for Nebraska didn't hurt them because they were playing an atrocious offense. Nebraska wins over Northwestern by 8. They're just a 2.5-point favorite at home against Purdue. Purdue has been competitive against just about everyone until they ran into Ohio State and got steamrolled. And so this is pretty much, in a sense, a pick'em game with Nebraska at home in this one. Over-unders 40.
Yeah, I like Nebraska. My simulation favors them by 7. So this is a game that jumped out when I was looking at my database simulations. But I do have, look, there's always concerns. There's no slam dunks with any of these. The one concern I do have is that Purdue's coming off the bye week. I think Purdue got their bye at the perfect time for several reasons. First of all, they're on a 1-4 straight up an ATS slide, their last 5. And they were coming off the Ohio State game on top of that, 41-7 loss against a physical team. So I think they really got the bye at the right time, and I do like to sometimes play teams like that off the bye. But I like Nebraska. My simulation favors them most weeks this season. I feel like they're an underrated team. Run the ball extremely well, and Purdue's been below average defensively. So even with the bye, I'm not sure it's going to fix that below average D. Nebraska holds a substantial defensive edge here and should control the line of scrimmage. So at -2.5 or less, there is some value with Nebraska.
All right, Jackson, you asked for it. And of course, it's one of the bigger games of the week, and certainly in the Pac-12, because Utah's coming off a win at the Coliseum as a 7-point dog with a backup quarterback, of course, with Cam Rising most likely out for the season for Utah. But we know Utah football, they're going to show up and be fundamentally sound, and they're a tough team, just like their coach. So they win against USC for a 3rd consecutive time over the last 2 years. Oregon has been playing well, of course, and they travel to Utah, an extremely difficult place to play, one of those tough places to play across college football, Rice-Eccles Stadium. The Ducks, a 6.5-point, I think I messed that up. They're a 6.5-point favorite, correct?
Yes,
on the road
favorite
at Utah. Yes, I mixed up the plus and minus. So the Ducks, a 6.5-point favorite at Utah.
Yes, and I'll be right. You would have been right this summer, though. The look-ahead line this summer is Utah -1.5. So the initial line this summer, a bettable line at some of the advanced books, where Oregon was going to be the dog here. So this is over a touchdown adjustment. Obviously, the quarterback situation has a lot to do with that. With that said, though, Utah's been dealing with that all season. They're still 6-1 straight up. They beat Florida. They beat UCLA. They beat USC last week. Their only loss came at Oregon State. So this is a really good Utah team, just a year in and year out, one of the best coached teams in college football. But they are offensively challenged this year. They're averaging just barely over 5 yards per play. Oregon's averaging 8 yards per play, so a substantial offensive edge. I think you can make a case that the under and Utah are somewhat correlated here. I can't imagine Utah wants to get in the shootout. I know they won a shootout last week, 34-32 against USC, but USC is a below average defensive team. Oregon is substantially better. With that said, there is some value, though, I think, with Utah at plus 6.5. Would like to get to plus 7 or more, which is a very key number, obviously. My database simulation, 10,000 games run through the database, on average has Oregon winning by just 4. And that does not factor in the altitude, the thin air, which is always tough on these West Coast teams as well. Do worry a little bit about Utah after that shootout against USC, if they're a little fatigued as well. So we'll call it, kind of negate the altitude edge. I'll call both teams fatigued. And that also could hurt the under a little bit because, the altitude and fatigue can obviously hurts the defense a little bit more, in my opinion. But I lean towards Utah here, plus 6.5. Would like to get plus 7 or more. And some other simulations I run, projections, a few of them have them winning outright, and several of them have them winning the yardage edge as well. So I think this is definitely a live underdog, even though, as you and I talked about earlier, we both like Oregon. They're a really good team. Another really tough spot for the Ducks, though, having to go to Utah and at Washington earlier this year.
Got our guy DeAndre, BGPO Football Funk. We appreciate you being here, DeAndre. Thank you for your contributions. And DeAndre calls all the time, and he enjoys the lines, and so I know he's soaking up this information in this conversation. So, folks, Steve's at wagertalk.com and WagerTalk TV. Please check it out. You will not regret checking it out. You will be happy. Just give it a look. Check it out. Again, Steve at WagerTalk TV, right here on YouTube, wagertalk.com as well. Let's stay in the Pac-12, Steve. We've got USC. Many had projected them to be in the college football playoff hunt. They lost that magical second game, so you got to worry about motivation. Lost on the last play of the game against Utah. They traveled to Cal to take on the Golden Bears. Not a quality football team, but they have made it tough on some opponents this year. USC's an 11-point favorite, and the over-under is, of course, a customarily high 67.5.
Yeah, I actually talked about this game earlier today on Wager Talk Today. People can go back and watch that replay on Wager Talk TV. Also gave out a free NBA season over-under wins total for people that like pro basketball. But I like Cal, and I like the over in this game. First of all, I was looking for a reason to play against USC. As you mentioned, the way they lost last week, second loss of the season. We've researched that over the years. The second loss this late in the season for teams that start off 6-0 or better is definitely a long-term winning play, fading those teams. So looking for a reason to play USC, and then I run the database simulation, and I have Cal losing by just 7.5 on average. So we actually get some line value here. And plus, I think their offense can trade points here. They definitely have backdoor cover potential. And keep in mind, this Cal team put up a lot of points, 58 points, 600 and over 660 yards in week 1 in North Texas. They put up 32 points at Washington. They put up 40 points against Oregon State a few weeks ago. So they can score against a very mediocre USC defense. My concern, though, with Cal, and I do lean that way, is that I'm not sure they can slow down USC. And if USC comes flat, I think it more likely shows on the defensive side more than it normally does. And USC is 6-1 to the over this year. So I think the over makes a lot of sense as well. And yes, the high 60s scares you off a bit, but at 67.5, I don't think it's high enough. So I like Cal, and I also like a little bit of a hedge towards the over, just in case they have trouble slowing down USC.
Ohio State's won 9 consecutive games against Wisconsin, but most of those have been pretty close affairs. Wisconsin typically plays the Buckeyes tough, but Ohio State gets the win. They go to Wisconsin coming off a game that they highly invested in against Penn State, a marquee matchup. And so there may be concern about a letdown. Primetime game at Wisconsin. The Badgers will be up for it. Have lost their starting quarterback, Tanner Mordecai. So Ohio State's a 14.5-point favorite. The over-under is only 43.5 for this one, as Ohio State more defensive team this year than they have been in the past. So your thoughts about this one, Steve?
Yeah, exactly. I think the total is telling you a lot here, right? That this is probably a live dog just due to the fact that it could be a low-scoring game. Whenever you get more than 2 touchdowns, that catches my eye, because if they can hang with them. The concern, obviously, is if Ohio State gets out to a quick lead, if they get up by double digits. Not sure this Wisconsin, offense has enough punch to keep it close at that point. But you bring up the possible letdown, and it's, once again, we talk a lot about letdowns, and it's something that's probably a bit overrated. But it's not necessarily that Ohio State doesn't show up. It's just very hard to have your A game every week, week in and week out, especially when you're talking about 19 and 20-year-old kids. And then you take that on top of the fact you're coming off a high-profile home game and now having to travel. And let's keep in mind, we don't just need Ohio State to win this game. We need them to win by more than 2 touchdowns. So I would lean towards Wisconsin based on the situational setup. And I think they also qualify as a good defensive dog that can run the ball, control the clock, and keep this one within a couple scores.
Why don't we do this one, folks? Steve and I are headed off to record our Under the Radar selection. Steve provides that for us each and every week here at the Voice of College Football. And so you get that for being a Patreon member, or you're right here already. Just sign up right here on YouTube. You get the selection as a YouTube member here on the main channel. So you can do that right now. Steve, 17-4 for you guys that follow wagering at all, at any level. Just let that sink in. You understand how difficult that is. 17-4 against the spread since week 1 of 2022. And Steve, if you have a second, does anybody have another game? One other game we could hit real quick? Any other games that you would like to see us hit on? We'll give you a going once, going twice. Anybody else with a lot of great comments? We appreciate everyone being here. But any other comments on any other games you would like Steve to hit on? All right. Well, we appreciate you being here, everyone. And again, check out Steve's Under the Radar selection, exclusive here at the Voice of College Football. You can stay right here and sign up for the YouTube channel membership. And again, it's Wager Talk TV right here on YouTube, and it's wagertalk.com. Okay, we've got a request of Arizona, Oregon State. Steve's going to have to track that one down. I don't have it.
Yeah, we got Notre Dame too. I'll do that one first because I actually did a standalone video on that one on Wager Talk TV earlier this week. Notre Dame Pitt, and I like Notre Dame in this game. I actually used a free play on them on one of the shows also on Wager Talk. My math model favors them by 23. They have Clemson next week, but we talk about bye weeks a lot. I think the bye came at a perfect time for Notre Dame last week, after those 4 games in a row against Ohio State, Duke, Louisville, the huge win against USC, and then Clemson on deck. You'd say, well, this is a terrible spot to be laying almost 3 touchdowns. But I think because Notre Dame had the bye last week, they're going to come to play here. And I like them at minus 20.5 or less, which is the current line. And one thing about Pittsburgh, they're 1-5 straight up in ATS, their last 6 since their opening win against Wofford. Their only winning cover during that span was against Louisville the week after Louisville had upset Notre Dame. So Pitt is really struggling right now. I think Notre Dame's the way to play that one. And the other one, the Arizona game, is an interesting game as well. That Pac-12's just been wide open this year. We talked about Oregon State being one of those ranked teams. It's played well at times. My math model on that one has a game at a pick'em. And currently Oregon State is a 3-point favorite, but I'm seeing a lot of 3.5s out there. So at 3.5 or more, I would start to say there's probably some line value with Arizona as I make the game a pick'em.
Arizona's straight up record is not impressive, but if you look at their week-to-week results, they have played extremely well. Took USC to triple overtime, close game against Washington, and then just annihilated Washington State inexplicably a couple of weeks ago by 38 points. All right, Steve and I are off to record our Under the Radar selection, and you can get that as a Patreon member or right here on the YouTube channel. Just sign up right here for your YouTube membership. You get a ton of other benefits, but we'll just, hey, that's in and of itself enough. 17-4 against the spread. Appreciate everyone being here. And again, it's Steve Merrill at Wager Talk TV and wagertalk.com.